welcome to this karaoke-free zone, you'll be relieved to hear. Now, given everything that's been happening in politics lately, I have to say the general election feels like quite a long time ago, but there's no escaping the inquest. Did the broadcasters get it wrong? Did we spend too much time looking at the polls? Did we get obsessed with so-called process stories? Well, all questions I'm going to be discussing with my panel, but first let me introduce them. It's very good of the former Lib Dem leader Nick Clegg to come here to discuss which might be possibly somewhat painful memories of the election campaign. Julie Etchingham was, of course, one of the great stars of the campaign with her very skillful chairing of that very wide-ranging debate. And for Faisal Islam from Sky, I think your first general election as political editor there brought a very kind of fresh approach to the way that you covered all those stories. But before we begin our discussion, I want to play you a short film, and you're going to be hearing from a couple of political spin doctors. And if you haven't been shouted at by both of them, then you can't really call yourself a political journalist. Let's see the film.
Taking a risk, having a punt, having a go, that pumps me up.
Am I tough enough? Tough enough? Hell yes, I'm tough enough.
Of course, I'd rather you supported West Ham.
These 6 pledges are now carved in stone.
What we're looking at doing is basically
The broadcast media has got some very specific questions to ask itself after the general election. I think that basically what happened was that broadcasters, other journalists did too, but we're talking about broadcasters, managed to persuade themselves that the one result that actually happened would be impossible.
If the polls had been right, it had been much easier for us to get broadcasters, get the press in general, to discuss the risk of a Tory second term. The last 3 weeks of the campaign shouldn't have been about a hung parliament and whether Labour would be propped up by the SNP, but about whether David Cameron was heading for a majority and what a majority Conservative government would mean.
A lot of people who should have been reporting the election wanted to be commentators and wanted to commentate on it, and they took certain things as truisms and used that as part of their commentary throughout. So, for example, Labour had a better ground campaign was a truism that was always used. The Conservatives can't win a majority was a truism that was always used. And you ended up in situations where BBC presenters were betting the Prime Minister £1,000 that he couldn't win a majority. You ended up in a situation where night after night, Newsnight would finish its programme or use right in the middle of its coverage of the election a poll which would say, big news tonight, the Conservatives are up 2 seats. But that absolutely was in the fabric of so much broadcast coverage, not just the BBC, but ITV, Channel 4, Sky News.
So much of the coverage was devoted to the prospect of a Labour-SNP coalition, the risk of a Labour-SNP coalition, what might happen if Ed Miliband is propped up by Alex Salmond, etc. That was the Tory agenda. They were placing those stories on the front page of the newspapers because they needed to make us the risk.
Yes, we did want to make the point that it is possible that the Labour Party could do a deal with the SNP. Now,
and the polls helped you there, didn't they?
The polls helped us say that they could do. You can argue that, and I think we could spend a very long time going through that, but the reality is, had the polls been different, had the polls been more accurate, then that may not have been a debate, but it's kind of a moot point because the reality is we would have been ahead.
We didn't want to get caught up in speculation. We wanted to say, no coalition with the SNP, no deal with the SNP, now let's talk about policies that matter.
But you didn't say that straight away, though, did you?
We said no coalition straight away. Perhaps we could have gone further, but we didn't want to get sliced and diced and, we wanted to say no coalition, and we're not going to answer more questions about that. That was a decision we took early on. Maybe we should have gone the whole hog right at the get-go.
What are the parties saying they're going to do on transport, education, health? What is their economic policy? What is their issue? What are they saying about the Constitution? Reporting that, criticising it, holding up to very, very heavy scrutiny is a very important thing to do. And it wasn't really done enough, if it was honest. The reality is vast tracts of the last month of the campaign, particularly in terms of broadcasting, you might as well have all just gone off on holiday and not actually done it.
Talk me through Edstone.
Well, it wasn't our most glorious moment, and it probably should have been stopped before it emerged blinking into the glare of publicity.
Do you remember seeing that on the telly and going, oh dear?
Yeah, I remember looking and thinking this isn't going to be great. The reason why it was there, the reason why we were doing it, was a function of our growing desperation to get coverage back to the issues, back to our positive agenda.
I think that we managed to, another way of putting it is setting the questions. So what are the issues for debate? And I think that we felt very clearly that who is competent to run the economy and what would happen if the Labour Party were in coalition with the SNP were two very good questions. I'm not sure when you interview Tom Baldwin that he could come back with any particularly brilliant questions that they asked us.
It's interesting, isn't it, that the two questions the Tories most wanted to get out were both attack questions on the Labour Party. They didn't have a positive offer. They didn't have a positive vision for the country. They wanted to take us down, which they did successfully. Was it a more effective campaign? Yes. Is negative campaigning and Linton Crosby style electioneering more effective? Yes. Could broadcast have helped mitigate that? Yes. Did it? No.
I want to begin with Nick Clegg. At the outset of the campaign, did you expect that there was going to be an overall Conservative majority? Because this is what a lot of people think was the underlying assumption that meant that some of the coverage went wrong.
No, nor did they, but...
They didn't?
No, absolutely not. No, they really didn't. I mean, look, I think and I actually agree with quite a lot of what both Tom and Craig said, in the sense that a lot of, particularly in the latter stages of the campaign, of the broadcast media, and the media coverage generally, was speculation rather than analysis. It was hypothesis rather than fact. It was endless crystal ball gazing about the future rather than sort of talking to people about the decision they need to make in the present. And there might be good reasons for that, the polls, the fact there had been a coalition government, so people were speculating on what another one might look like, the fact that significant vested interests in the written press were pushing a lot of that. But it had two very big consequences. One is it had a determining factor on the outcome. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind at all. I saw it in seat after seat after seat, that this growing alarm about the SNP Labour tie-up and the kind of amplification of the Conservative message and the way it was also being sort of echoed in the broadcast media terrified a lot of English voters and sort of pushed them in a Conservative direction. But the second, perhaps even more serious consequence is that we now have a government in power which wasn't subject to any meaningful scrutiny at all about what they might do if they were in power on their own. And that seems to me to be really significant. So you've got a government that's kind of, I think, almost accidentally got into power. They didn't expect it at all, but was never asked any searching questions. And that's why I think Tom Baldwin is quite right about what they would do if they were ever in power on their own. And that is not healthy in a democracy.
Julie Etchingham, the idea of a Conservative majority wasn't questioned, wasn't interrogated enough.
Well, I think I would take up on the point that Nick just made there, that there wasn't the scrutiny, because you know, as well as many other political journalists will know, Martha, that issue, for example, of the £12 billion worth of cuts that was we knew was on the table in terms
the welfare
of
cuts.
The welfare cuts. I could barely move for hearing interviews trying to press the Conservatives on that issue, similarly pressing Labour on the issue of how much they might borrow. The scrutiny levels were there. There were very hard interviews. You did them yourself. You switch on in the morning, you'd hear them too. I know ITN certainly covered them. ITV News certainly covered them. And actually, if the Tories were saying, you depend on a strong economy and then you get a strong NHS and then you get other issues. Frankly, those questions needed answering, and they were pressed hard on them. They were raised during the leaders' debates, and they were raised as part of the interrogations that came up as part of the campaign.
Nick, do you want to come back on that?
No, I totally accept they wouldn't have wanted to answer those questions, but I think, and I'm sure Julie's right, I'm sure these questions were asked, they were raised in interviews and so on. But I don't think, and by the way, this is not a sort of exercise in finger pointing. I think the whole media and political elite did become completely sort of absorbed about just discussing hypothetical outcomes and then actually dwelling on a hypothetical outcome which didn't happen and ignoring a hypothetical outcome which did happen. And all I'm saying is that, in a sense, returning to sort of good old-fashioned traditions of simply asking parties and politicians what they're proposing to voters and then letting voters decide is a tradition which was obscured by all of that.
FAISAL.
I think the first thing to say, in that video, there was more spin from two spin doctors in a Lancashire cotton mill. It was unbelievable. I can't quite believe some of the things that they said in that video, both of them, frankly. You can work out, I'm going to tell you two stories now, you can work out which one was which here. The first one is, it's a Friday. We want, constantly, of course we want to discuss the issues. And on one of these days, we had, I think, literally record jobs numbers. 12-year high in employment or something like that. I can't remember exactly what the number was. And I was a bit, I thought we should probably be covering this a bit higher, just as a sort of dispassionate, objective numbers story. It's not biased. It's come out today. We've got to report that. That's an important piece of context. The phone call comes, and I get in there first. And I say, OK, do you know what? Yeah, OK. Those jobs numbers. I'm like, well, what are you talking about, the jobs numbers? Why aren't you reporting Labour in the SNP? You know, and so to sort of hear someone sort of say, why aren't you reporting the issues? I mean, honestly, I can't take that hugely seriously.
No idea who that might be.
Hugely seriously. Flip it round, okay?
Yeah.
It was a tactic, though. I mean, politics is not a game, but a campaign is a game, okay? And it was a successful tactic. The media and the public could have responded in different ways. They could have. Clearly, it was meant to kind of cultivate fear about Ed Miliband and the prospect of a weak Labour government. There were ways to combat that for the Labour Party, and as it turned out, it was bad for Nick's party too, and he could also have combated it. People may have responded to the posters of Alex Salmond as a pickpocket, not with kind of, I'm scared, but I'm disgusted. We don't know. It was a risk that they took. How none of the other parties didn't respond to that and fight it. I mean, I did it, the one interview I did with David Cameron in the back of the coach, I got him to admit that there was one party leader standing for office in 2015 who had signed off a deal with the SNP, and that was him, in minority government. Now, if Labour can't use that fact, and he admitted it, to fight, you know, it's not my job to do that, but they didn't play the game, if you like, well enough on that front. But I think the other point is that there is an issue, I would say, about the interaction between broadcasters and newspapers. When you have a situation where the majority of the newspaper press is behind one party in this fight, some of the newspapers are emailing their readers, telling them to vote a certain way. I think there are questions to ask about how broadcasters view the newspapers as some sort of... what prism is that? It's a lens that is coloured. It's not an impartial lens. And that has consequences, I think.
But Julie, okay, there's obviously, you know, we'll have arguments about what spin doctors do and don't do, and the question of the newspapers, the part that they play. But is there a risk of broadcasters being too smug, too defensive? Were there mistakes made?
Well, I think there were, I mean, given that the parties themselves were surprised by the outcome in the end, we were all surprised at the exit poll. You know, there wouldn't be a journalist who was in a newsroom on election night when we got that exit poll would not comment on the sort of gasp, you know, that went up when we saw those exit poll numbers. Similarly, the politicians...
What was it like in the ITN studio
well,
that night?
It was, you know, we got the exit poll through and we thought, right, gosh, right. And then we got straight into the studio. I was working with this big graphics panel called our Commons calculator. We were very careful not to call it a coalition calculator. You know,
we're relieved about that. Yeah.
Well, I'd practiced all sorts of maths, you know, not since my sort of maths O level. I'd been slapping figures about in the way that I did, but in the end, actually, of course, the figures were, you know, pretty stark when we got them through. We had actually, incidentally, done a rehearsal at the beginning of the year, which was with a Conservative majority. We rehearsed almost every sort of combination of figures we could have possibly thrown into it.
But would it have been fair to say that most of your calculations were based on it not being a Conservative majority?
Well, we examined all those possibilities, but of course we were going to. I mean, we're having this conversation on the, you know, anniversary of the Scottish referendum. And I think, you know, very many roads of the general election, you know, lead back to that moment. And as soon as we saw that point at which the SNP looked as if they were going to perform as strongly as they, you know, did in the end, of course it shaped some of the narrative of how you went about covering the election. You know, when you were talking about what that potential effect that then has on Labour's numbers, you know, we're not just talking about us responding to something that the newspapers or the spin operation were dreaming up. We were responding to what, you know, was clearly the reality on the ground.
Which was, it was a political earthquake, wasn't it, what happened in Scotland?
It was, but can I just question the whole premise of this? It's kind of like, I'm slightly surprised by the sort of the framework. It's not, you, dare I say it, shouldn't judge whether you've done well or not, or whether you've predicted an outcome, whether you've predicted the future right or not. I mean, broadcasting is not soothsaying. That's what I find so odd about this. I accept that newspapers have an axe to grind, right? And we have, particularly at the moment, right now, we've got some big vested interests in Britain, where the preponderance of the loud vested interests in our newspaper media are right of centre and will do everything they can to, and I think what FAISAL says, the relationship between you guys and newspapers is up to you, but that is an important point. But broadcasters at election time are surely beyond and above everything else, there to scrutinise, as you say, to interrogate, to challenge politicians, to draw out for the public what the choice is for the public for them to make, not to judge your own success on whether you got some hypothetical assumption about the future right or not. The future is unknowable, and it's so odd that people are now beating themselves up for having discovered that the future is not a fact until it happens. And,
yes, but
and that's what I find so odd.
But I suppose what the argument is, and I think it's the argument that Craig Oliver was making in the film, is that because there was so much coverage of the process, of the coalitions and so on, it drowned out some of the more important...
But I have to say, I have a lot of sympathy with FAISAL there. For Craig Oliver, who I sort of know a bit, to say that when the Conservatives were given... But look, basically what happened, I know it wasn't done intentionally, but basically what happened was the massive, massive amount of broadcast coverage devoted to the possible hypothetical outcome of a Labour SNP government was like giving the richest party in British politics, the Conservatives, hundreds of millions of pounds of additional attack ad funding. That's the effect, because that was their attack message. That, I bet, I wouldn't be inelegant as asking you whether this is true, but I bet you they were continually ringing you guys and saying, why don't you focus on the SNP? That's the way they got elected. So, that's why I think this is worth dwelling on quite, at length, because it had a determining effect on the outcome, and it meant also that the government that was elected attempts might have been made, but wasn't rigorously scrutinising what they would do if they were in power on their own.
I think a military historian might see some Maginot-Line thinking here from the broadcasters. Clearly, in 2010, and I don't know how much of this Nick will probably publish in a book or something, there had been some talks and sniffing around about potential coalitions. And looking back at 2010, although I wasn't a Pollard at that point, in 2015 you're thinking, well, what happened in 2010? Had they started talking already? Or at least George Osborne had got William Hague to map out what he'd get the Lib Dems to compromise on. And so, you're thinking, what did we miss in 2010? Let's make sure we nail it in 2015. So there's a little bit of that. I think, there is no soothsayer, there is no crystal ball. There has been in the past, you can extrapolate kind of past patterns and project them forward. This election in particular was a total structural break, partly because of Scotland, but there were 4 or 5 big macro trends, whether it was the Lib Dem vote, unfortunately for Nick, collapsing, whether it was Labour not quite convincing in England, and then UKIP, as it turned out, causing Labour as much trouble as the Conservatives in terms of the seats that they had to win. All of those interacted in a deeply complicated system. That does not mean that analysing the trends and of voters is bad or wrong. All the parties were doing it. And in many ways, the victory that we now think, why didn't we predict it, was a result of the Conservatives, for example, seeing that the Labour SNP line had salience not just in Labour seats, but it had salience, and you wouldn't really have predicted this, in Lib Dems. Lib Dems could be persuaded, or Lib Dem seats could be turned, that had 5-figure majorities in their direction. They analysed it, they changed their behaviour. That push only happened in the last 2 weeks of the election. So I think just projecting stuff forward, that essentially caused the financial crisis, and in this case, it wasn't the right thing to do. So our job is not to predict to have some imaginary soothsaying capacity to read the tea leaves, but if you like to map out the contours of what's happening and what's changing, and that matters even more when you have an atomized and disaggregated political system where things that weren't in the centre of the frame in terms of the debate, whether that's leaving the EU, I know all sorts of things could now be up for debate that we didn't think were for debate. So I think a little bit more humility is probably required, and an admission that we can't actually predict the future, and perhaps we never could.
And Nick Clegg, one Conservative was saying to me that if we'd actually, if journalists had, I mean, of course, there was some coverage around the country, but if we'd looked more analytically about what was happening in the southwest, what was happening to the Liberal Democrats there, we might have given us a better picture of the election overall. Do you think that's fair?
No, I think so much bogus wisdom with hindsight. I really, it's honestly, look, we were talking earlier before we came on. In the southwest, for instance, postal votes happen, whatever it is, 2 or 3 weeks before the actual election. Now, postal votes used to be predominantly for the elderly, those who were away on holiday or whatever, but actually more and more people are applying for postal votes. And the Liberal Democrats, like every political party, we canvass people who, on the doorstep, who said they're going to vote postally, and then we canvass them again after they voted postally. So most political parties have a pretty good idea about what's happening to votes that are actually being cast. Thousands of the votes are being cast well before election day. And I know for a fact that in most of our southwest seats, not all of them, most of our southwest seats, we were either at level pegging or in some of them actually marginally ahead in the canvass data that we had 2 or 3 weeks before the election. Something happened in those last 2 or 3 weeks. I think Faisal is quite right to say the skill and the technical skill with which the Conservatives exploited this very profound sense of fear in England about risk to the economy because of Labour and everyone dancing to Alex Salmond's tune was incredibly well executed. It had huge amounts of money behind it, and, floods of letters and emails and telephone calls targeted at Liberal Democrat voters, for instance, very cleverly saying, hello, I'm that nice chap on letters, I'm that nice chap David Cameron, I know you're a Liberal Democrat, I'm not asking you not to be a Liberal Democrat, I'm asking you to lend me your vote because there's a great bigger risk to the country at the moment of Miliband and Salmond. It was brilliant, it was well done, and they did very well. But that happened, the effect of it was massively amplified, for the subject of this morning, was massively amplified day in, day out in millions of people's living rooms because of the coverage which was devoted to that hypothetical outcome on the broadcast. And that did have a material effect.
And you said it had effect. Now, I would like to know there are lots of journalists and broadcasters in the audience, so I'd like to bring some in now. James Harding is here from the BBC, if you'd like to. So, quite a serious accusation there that the coverage of the BBC and the other broadcasters actually determined the outcome of the general election.
Thank you, Martha. Oh, dearie me. I have to say, my starting point on this is different. This was my first experience covering or being involved in the coverage of an election on television. And I think if you look at 2015, actually in many ways, it confounded the futurologists that said television is not the place where the big political debate happens. Actually, it turned out that it was. And the 2015 election campaign on television was fascinating, it was gripping. If you look at big things, the BBC, I'm proud to say, James Landale broke what was probably the biggest story of the campaign on television, the question of Cameron's third term. I thought ITN confounded all the skeptics when it came to the seven-way debate. Julie provided a masterclass in broadcasting that you could actually make that work. It was not clear that there were going to be any debates, any real format that would engage the public. In the end, it was a question time in Leeds where you really heard from people what they thought and how they felt.
But what did the broadcasters get wrong?
I'll come to that in a second. But there's been a fair bit of, woe is us. But actually, we should just stop and say it was a really extraordinary campaign. And the election night itself was personally one of the most exciting experiences I've ever had as a journalist. I came out of the election campaign and I said a few things afterwards. Clearly there was too much coalitionology, right? Clearly that was the case. That happened in interviews. I think there are a couple of important reasons for that. Asking a question is different from getting it answered. And so the fact that there was an effort by broadcasters and journalists of all stripes to try and get at big issues welfare cuts, future budgets. The fact that those weren't addressed doesn't mean those questions weren't asked. And every single political party had an interest in the coalition narrative. So the Lib Dems had their blue kip narrative, as we've heard, the Tories had their Labour SNP narrative, that Labour had a coalition narrative that worked for them too, which was that the Tories weren't doing as well as people expected. There was a reason for it. That said, I think there is a really important lesson for all of us in this, which is we do, as Faisal points out, tend to cover general elections with an eye to what happened last time. And if you started in 2001, no one would have predicted that 2005 would have been so dominated by Iraq. In 2005, no one would have predicted that it would have been so dominated in 2010 by the financial crisis. And in 2010, no one would have predicted that 2015 would have been so dominated by Scotland. So I do think there's a big issue for us, and a big lesson there for us. And the second thing I would say is we haven't really touched on the debates. And there is, I think, a question for us now as we look ahead at the referendum, we look ahead at 2020, how we make sure those are managed properly and carefully in advance so there's not a wrangle right up at the last minute.
Okay, I mean, Julie, what's your, just picking up on that, you know, you
well,
probably
you know, I was not involved in the negotiations is the first thing I'd like to say about that. But, you know, clearly it would be far more preferable to be able to concentrate on policy content and not you know, a wrangling over whether and how a debate takes shape. So, you know, I don't think anybody would disagree with the proposition that, you know, whatever we need to do, it would be great to just get it organised and done so there's clarity about it where everybody knows where they stand on them. I do think they contribute an enormous amount. I mean, it was ITV's, I think, second highest rating show after, you know, the soaps last year. There was a great sort of engagement with it with social media. You know, and all of the debates in their various forms, I think, contributed something really useful and beneficial to the general wider debate that was happening in the run-up to the election. So I think, you know, I'm not the person who sits there and makes those deals and has to, thankfully, negotiate with the parties, but clarity would obviously be a great benefit.
And Faisal, on the first part of James Harding's mea culpa there, the too much concentration on coalitionology. I mean, if you look at the British election study, and they did this for newspapers as well, but they found that 46% of television stories were about the election process. You know, is that something that broadcasters need to learn from?
As James says, that's what they were talking about. All the parties were talking about it. I mean, I think at Nick's manifesto launch, it was, everyone knows there can't be a majority government, and so preferably, we would have had, you know, a series of reports covering a big issue of the day, and that would have been the moment to have that debate. But, you know, we didn't have the debates as they were in 2010 either. That would have been a good opportunity to go through all of these issues as well and get them to the maximum audience. So I think people who are saying, why didn't we discuss the issues more? Well, we could have had more debates, and they were stopped for reasons that we know.
And Nick Clegg, I mean, it's right, isn't it? That was part of your pitch, was there was going to be a coalition, you were going to be the moderating force.
Sorry, no one, yes it was, and that there might have been indecisive outcome is one thing. That the whole broadcast industry dwelt on one very specific hypothetical outcome, Labour SNP, is completely different. And that's what drove so much voter behaviour in the last stages of the election. And can I just look? I'm certainly not coming here to suggest anyone here should sort of beat yourself up because everyone got swept up in all of this. I'm just saying, since learning from the past is the best way to prepare for a future. It is. I just think what's happened, certainly in all the elections I fought, which I'd never seen on this scale before, was not that it was boring or it was very exciting. James, of course, is right. Of course, it was electrifying for those people who are interested in politics. But for one reason or another, the speculation on that particular outcome only helped one party to the exclusion of others, and did mean that particular party wasn't subject to scrutiny for policies which are now being put in practice. And I just afraid I do not accept at all the implication that, well, we couldn't get any answers on the 12 billion. If one can spend hours and hours and hours speculating on a hypothetical outcome, which didn't turn out, I suspect we can all spend hours and hours and hours pressing people to explain why on earth they're going to take £12 billion away from some of the poorest families in this country. I just do not accept that that's not possible. If we can create news almost out of hypothetical thin air, then we can subject politicians to scrutiny in a more rigorous way as well.
And I was very interested in something you said at the outset, which is that the Conservatives themselves didn't think that they were going to win an overall majority.
No.
Does that include David Cameron?
Oh yeah, I don't think they thought so. I think partly for the reasons I explained later, quite a lot of the movement to the Conservative direction, certainly in the seats that I know, Liberal Democrat seats, clearly we sort of went into the election as damaged goods because of the coalition. We were braced for a bad result, but I think that bad result, a catastrophic one, happened quite late on, partly, as Faisal quite rightly points out, because of some extremely effective, well-designed, well-executed and well-resourced campaigning techniques from the Conservatives, but partly because of these wider reasons.
But they didn't realise that was happening.
No, I think everyone's taken by surprise. And by the way, I don't think we should... I think it's a good thing that democracy pulls off surprises. I mean, life would be extremely boring if every election was entirely predictable from the beginning. It's supposed to be an unpredictable outcome. That's why I don't think the exam question should be, why did we not predict the future? The exam question should be, was the way in which politicians were asked to explain themselves, did that facilitate voters' ability to make up their own minds, or did it actually, unwittingly perhaps, shape the way in which voters made up their minds?
Let's take a couple more. Peter Bazalgette, and are there other broadcasters? There's John Hardy, or is there anybody from Sky who'd like to come in? And Stuart Purvis. Okay, Peter Bazalgette.
Yeah, I've got a mic actually, so they put it up. I think we need just to spend a bit more time talking about the election debates. The news organisations spent about a year having a sterile argument with the party politicals, trying to put in what is essentially an American format, which is the politicians debating with each other. Julie chaired her edition of that absolutely brilliantly. But it's actually, in all honesty, a pretty ghastly format. And as voters, we hate seeing politicians argue with each other.
They get big audiences.
Audiences are not the only thing that guarantee quality, Martha. In the last week of the election... That's what I say to myself in politics. Yeah. Well said. I'll be very quick. In the last week of the election campaign, we discovered that we had a format that had been there for 30 years that did it brilliantly and far better, and it's called Question Time. And there was an edition in Leeds. And the members of the public, unmediated by, I may say, the rather arrogant media, of which, of course, I am a member, were able to ask questions directly to the politicians. It was a brilliant programme. It was the most revelatory programme. More than that, Gogglebox covered it. And if I suggest you get the Gogglebox edition and watch the public's visceral reaction to the performance of the politicians, that edition of Gogglebox told us what the result of the election was going to be before election day, if you watch it. So let the public talk to the politicians and stop the politicians arguing with each other. We're not interested.
Okay, did Stuart Purvis want to put me a point?
Yes, my question is also about the debates. It's about probably the oddest debate ever to happen on British television, which was the debate of 5, the so-called Challengers debate, which, to remind you, was Labour, Greens, SNP, and UKIP, but not the Conservatives or the Liberal Democrats. We know why the Conservatives were not there, because David Cameron didn't want to do it and was prepared to take the risk. So my question is to Nick, why were you not there?
Well, I wasn't invited.
Why weren't you invited?
Ask the broadcasters.
Isn't that an extraordinary situation?
Yeah,
that you were allowed yourself to be sidelined, to be effectively associated with the Conservative Party in not being in the debate, thus passing up an opportunity to take part in a debate where you could have criticised your former coalition partners?
Yeah, well, tell me about it.
Well, how could that have come about?
Because I don't run the debates. Look, I mean, the point I would make, which I think Julie's made, and by the way, I totally endorse everything that was said about Julie's brilliant chairing of that debate. I was very sceptical, both about the sort of viewability of that format, and indeed the one in Leeds. And I have quite a lot of sympathy with what you said, Peter, about the way in which letting the public have their say, rather than having all the sort of political media professionals have their say, is the way forward. But what we need to do, we just need to drain this whole process of the politics and the argy-bargy and the negotiation and the threat and the counter-threat which disfigured all of this. What we should do is what they did in America after the presidential debates sort of went didn't happen for over a decade. They created an independent commission on the debates, and at the beginning of each sort of cycle, they promulgate rules which a tradition has now developed, the presidential candidates respect. What happened this time was absolutely farcical for everyone concerned. You know, the broadcasters in good faith came up with a proposal, then the politicians replied, then the broadcasters said, no, okay, we're fed up with this, this is our final offer. It turned out not to be the final offer. Then poor James had to scurry around trying to cobble together. The whole thing was hopeless. We've got to try and take all of that sort of cloak and dagger, backroom kind of argy-bargy out of it. I think what you need, you can come up with all sorts of criteria. We should have objective criteria which determine who participates and how and when. You could say, for instance, that a certain threshold of support from the previous election needs to be met, and for instance that since it's a UK-wide election, I personally think one obvious criteria might be that that parties should be seeking to stand candidates in the vast majority of constituencies. It was an irony that a lot of the attention in those debates was actually devoted to parties which weren't even hoping or pretending to govern the United Kingdom.
But of course, in a sense, some of the television debates have been part of certainly American politics for a long time, increasingly part of ours. But what we're seeing increasingly is the use of social media. And I wonder, Faisal and Julie, what you made of that? And people talk about the kind of the howl-around effect. Andy Marr wrote a new statement about this journalists just talking to other journalists.
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, I think if a judicious use of social media, you'd have picked up what was beginning to happen in Scotland, you'd have picked up some of the Corbyn stuff as well. It's an extremely helpful tool. More, though, it's sort of changing journalism, and we have this kind of immediate return path. Everything we say immediately, you know, even now I see that there's this debate about whether if you call Jeremy Corbyn left-wing, why don't we call the government right-wing? You know, people are questioning every word we use instantly and in real time, and that's great. That is accountability. We're hugely accountable. But there's lots of partisans making arguments about being biased. There's someone called Fascist Cow that's complaining that I'm biased. And I'm just like, okay, all right. I mean, I can probably live with that. That's what she calls herself. Sorry, I wasn't
we don't worry with you. We got that.
Self-defining. So I think it is transforming the way that we interact with our viewers.
Can it be transforming it in a dangerous way? I mean, there is a view that the Twitter sphere is by and large more biased towards the left, and if journalists are paying a lot of attention to Twitter, they're not getting a broader picture.
Well, I think actually, you know, it's one of those issues that Westminster itself has to grapple with, and perhaps the broadcasters and journalists in general have to grapple with. You know, we are, of course, very attentive to what's going on in the Twitter sphere, but the best way to get out and know what's actually happening onto the ground is to get out of London primarily, to get out and do your reporting on the ground elsewhere. We did the leaders' profiles out with everybody from Nicola Sturgeon, you know, Nick was with Tom Bradby, I was out with Nigel Farage as well. You know, you get out there and you feel the air, and, you know, there's even more pressure, I think, both on Westminster politicians and journalists in general to do that in the wake of this election.
It's just worth saying that the Conservatives put a lot of time and effort into Facebook rather than Twitter. Facebook was a way in which, not just to get the broad mass of Middle England, Middle Scotland, but also Middle England mainly, but also to highly target your message as well.
Okay, I think we've got time. We can squeeze one last question in for somebody. Yeah. If you just say where you're from, thanks.
Hi, Jeff Hill, editor of ITV News. I just want to turn the table slightly on the debate into how the parties manage the campaign. From our perspective, there was a real attempt to sort of manage the news agenda on a daily basis. And one example, Nick, not your party, but from Tom Baldwin, we found out about the non-dom policy, for example, but this was embargoed for the newspapers, and we had this bizarre situation that Julie remember on News at 10, where we couldn't report a positive policy, and yet it appeared on our newspaper review at the end of News at 10. And I'm also confused as to why there's a manifesto launch, and then every day after the manifesto launch, there's a big announcement about education or health or whatever it might be. And it just feels, from our perspective, as Ofcom regulated broadcasters, and we obviously take it as we see it, is there something that the political parties could learn from the way the campaign was managed?
Oh, listen, I think if ask any politician, if we could be released from this remorseless daily grinding pressure to produce something new, no one would be more delighted, I think, well, certainly than me and large parts of the political class. We've all got ourselves into this, into this sort of cul-de-sac, really, where we have, people are trying to sort of drum up new news when it's old news. We're told, as the political class, not by you, but we're often told, if you haven't got anything new for us, we're not going to cover you. So we have to sort of scrabble around to find something new. And everybody knows it's rather synthetic, and it's not healthy. And of course, as Peter quite rightly says, it turns large swathes of the public, it turns them off completely. And just linked to the earlier question, I think those people who are really interested in politics and current affairs have always been a minority of the population. I think the difference between many normal people who are just getting on with their life, who politics intrudes on them from time to time when they have to traipse to a polling station on a wet Thursday afternoon, but the rest of the time they can't be really bothered, and those of us who are interested in politics, I think that difference has become amplified through social media. And I think the danger for all of us, and I direct this just as much at Westminster politicians as anybody else, is that we are talking to ourselves in an echo chamber where politics is becoming entertainment, whatever the headline is, who's up, who's down, and most of it totally doesn't impinge on millions of people's ordinary lives at all. And then we're all terribly surprised when they act differently to how we expect when election comes. Well, it's not actually that surprising, because they've been travelling down a completely different path. And I do think we need to be quite, and I hear it in the Labour Party now. The Labour Party, in my view, one of the reasons why they're in such terrible danger is they're confusing the fact that a couple of thousand people have turned up to a debate to hear Jeremy Corbyn with what the British public, clearly they're not the same. It's ridiculous to conflate the two.
Well, we could spend, I think, several more hours discussing what's happening currently in the Labour Party, but some fascinating insights on the last general election, possibly some lessons for elections in the future, European referendum as well. But thank you very much indeed to my panel, Faisal Islam, Julie Etchingham and Nick Clegg. Thank you very much.